Hey everybody, Brett from AstartesGaming here, back with another Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord developer blog video. Today we're checking out the developer blog from February 8th, 2018, and this is part 1 of 2 about the lore surrounding the Calradian Empire, which, as you guys might be aware, is sort of the main faction in Bannerlord that is, at least at the time of, when the game starts, split into 3 factions that are all sort of at war with each other. And they go into a little bit of the backstory behind that situation in this blog. So let's go ahead and check it out. So for the next feature in our blog post series on Bannerlord's factions, we shall look at the Empire. Because the Empire is in some ways the center of gravity of the game, we're going to divide this blog into 2 parts. At the start of the game, the Empire is divided into 3 factions engaged in a civil war. But before we describe the 3 factions and what they stand for, let us look at how the conflict started. So, 1,000 years ago, the Calradoi were one of a dozen tribes living in the hill country between the Southern Sea and the Botanian Woods. So I would assume that would be somewhere roughly where Swadia is in Moorband, because the Botanian Woods are in the northwest part of the map, and the Southern Sea is obviously at the bottom. So it's a pretty wide area that they're describing there. But given that they're talking about hills and not mountains, I would assume that either they're talking about the hills south of the mountains where Rhodox is, or the hills immediately north of it. So one of those 2 areas. So over time, they subjugated their neighbors, forcing them into a confederation of city-states. Perhaps they were slightly fiercer than the others, or just lucky, or perhaps it was one tradition that set them apart. The Calradoi had no kings. Ever since the hero Eschurion slew the tyrant Sipegos, or Kipegos, probably a soft C there, but I don't know for sure. The institution of the monarchy was banned, in theory at least. There was an assembly of free citizens that met occasionally, a senate of elders, in practice the largest landowners, so kind of like an oligarchy, that sat permanently, and when it was absolutely necessary, supreme command could be invested for a short time in the person of an emperor, a title that back then meant little more than the right to lead an army. So it sounds like they're going for, at least in the background of this faction, very like Roman Republic type setting. You have very similar government like processes happening here. Although the Confederation of City-States sounds almost more like Athens prior to the Peloponnesian War. So maybe they're going with a little bit of Greek influence as well. We do know that ultimately the faction is very Byzantine, so that would sort of make sense because the Byzantines were Roman, but they did have a very heavy Greek influence, especially later on. So it historically would make sense to kind of, take the spin that way. So from their homeland, from their heartland in the hills, the Calradoi began to spread outward. As they did so, their political traditions, never written down, began to change. Soon the army was in the field more years than not, and gradually the emperors stopped retiring at the end of campaigns. So yes, very Roman. The senators, meanwhile, moved to the conquered provinces and acquired great estates. The capital moved from place to place, and as the assembly of the people was called wherever the emperor desired. In practice, this was usually an army camp where his veterans could be relied upon to shout down any opposition. The question of succession was always a potential crisis. Usually the emperor nominated an heir, the Senate ratified his choice, and the people, meaning the army, acclaimed it. But this did not always happen smoothly, and then the succession was settled on the battlefield of a civil war. So this is very, very Roman in influence, especially in the later Roman periods where essentially the only form of succession that was set in stone was that basically an emperor titled the Augustus would nominate his heir, whether it be his son or an adopted son or something, would name his son a Caesar, and that basically meant that he was like like a co-emperor slash emperor in waiting type thing. And even that didn't guarantee a smooth succession, as you guys are probably well aware. But that was generally the practice that sort of guaranteed a line of succession. And there was a lot of times where that didn't happen. And especially in the later Western Roman Empire, there was a lot of pretenders who were essentially just generals whose armies declared them either Caesars or Augusti, I guess would be the plural of that. And so they were basically just emperor because their army said that they should be, or because they told their army that they should be, and their army said sure. So, yeah, it seems like a lot of the history of this is pretty well in line with what we've seen in the Roman Empire. Although, obviously, they have made some distinct differences, the capital moving around, which actually in the later Roman period, that did happen as well. Rome was obviously the capital for a very long time, but later on it was moved to Mediolanum, or Milan, and it remained there for a while. And then the argument could be made that during the reign of Honorius, who is one of the sons of Theodosius, the capital was sort of moved to Ravenna. I don't know if it was officially moved. I'd have to read up on that, but I know that there was a period where he was basically reigning from Ravenna because Ravenna was more defensible than Mediolanum was. But at that point, the general, or I guess he was a magister militum, which is more like a field marshal. He was effectively, did I even say his name? The magister militum Stilicho, having a hard time saying that for some reason. He was effectively running the Western Roman Empire, so putting Honorius in Ravenna was more just to like keep him safe than it was for him to actually rule from there. Anyways, we get a nice little screenshot of some Calradian Empire cavalry here. I don't think these are cataphracts, although they are pretty heavily armored to the point where they could be. But we have seen some of the cataphracts that the Empire is using, and I think they have heavier armor than this. So yeah, I would think that these are probably just like the standard heavy cavalry, and then the cataphracts are more like dedicated lancers, at least from what we've seen of them in the multiplayer gameplay. Anyways, 20 years ago, a general named Arennicus donned the purple mantle worn by the emperors and placed the laurel crown that was not a crown on his brow. So they're even using laurels. His military record, his diligence in rooting out corruption and inefficient magistrates, and the confidence he could inspire with a single speech made him a popular ruler. He had also had the gift of being everything to everyone. He rose to prominence as a man of the people and the army, but he also worked closely with landlords and let them believe he might restore power of the Senate. He praised the Calradian Republic ideals as the pinnacle of human achievement, yet married the daughter of a petty king from the lands east of the empire to shore up an important trade route, formed an elite bodyguard of foreign mercenaries loyal only to him, sort of like the Varangian Guard in the Eastern Empire, who were basically like Kievan Rus Vikings that were made into the Eastern Emperor's personal bodyguard, and turned a blind eye when cults began to worship him as a sacred monarch. He spoke of a revived Calradia, but kept his counsel on the details. So, it sounds like this character might be based on Julius Caesar. There's definitely elements that they've borrowed from him, although not everything. I guess they've tried to at least make him somewhat distinct, and not just like a renamed Julius Caesar. But there's definitely parallels there, especially the sort of duplicitous nature of praising the Republic while having very tyrannical tendencies. That was something very, very I'm not sure what the word is. It definitely applied to Julius Caesar. He definitely had tyrannical tendencies. Obviously, like he is basically credited with being responsible for the fall of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the true like imperial Rome. Although he was not the first emperor, he never called himself emperor. That would have been his successor, Augustus Caesar. Anyways, let's keep moving. So there was one shadow hanging over the reign of Arennicus, his reluctance to choose an heir. It was though he was casting around for someone who grasped his vision but never found one. Traditionally, emperors looked in three places for their successors: their families, the elders of the Senate, and the upper ranks of the army. His one child, Ira, was a daughter. There had been ruling empresses of Calradian in the past, but Ira had a wild and irreverent streak. Her right to rule was championed by her mother, Regea, Arennicus' foreign-born wife. It is good for the children of emperors to succeed their fathers, her partisans said. If we unite in loyalty to the imperial family, the civil wars will not stop. Of course, we know throughout history that's never been true. Imperial families or royal families often create civil wars of their own, especially between siblings, fighting over the crown. So, yeah, I mean, that's not a guarantee of anything. A faction of powerful nobles under the honorable but stiff-necked aristocrat Lucan demanded that the Senate choose the next emperor. We understand politics and law, they said. Return to the old days, return power to us. Meanwhile, the wildly popular Garios, victor of wars against Britannia and the Aserai, let it be known, they're missing the word there, that he expected his veterans to be allowed to acclaim a new emperor. The corruption of the powerful saps our strength, he told his men. Let you, the soldiers who bleed for this land, choose its rulers. Okay, and so assuming that's probably the three faction leaders that we're going to be seeing. So we have the daughter of the emperor, Ira, who, if we're looking at like royal lineages, is probably the most legitimate. If we're talking about like direct succession, but since they don't seem to have any sort of defined succession, you could pretty much argue that any of these people are legitimate. Then we have, I assume, Lucan, who is the leader of... Well, actually, he's not the leader of the Senate, but I guess he's the leader of the faction of nobles that is backed by the Senate. So he would probably be their choice, and that's why he's saying that the Senate should choose. So we have Ira, Lucan, and then lastly Garios, who is a general and would be like a military dictator. But I imagine that they are probably going to balance the factions evenly, despite, you know, this in real life, Garios here would probably have the greatest military backing. And so if we were looking at like a real life historical situation, what you'd probably see is Ira killed or executed. Then Lucan would hold like Rome, for example, and then he would be in like there's several examples of it, but he would be like Pompey, for example, and then Garios would be your Julius Caesar. Although in this case, he's probably more like Augustus Caesar in that case, because he is effectively the one that's controlling most of the military, and so he would be marching to Rome to take it by force, while Lucan, backed by the aristocrats in the Senate, is holding it, but doesn't really have a lot of military support. But again, in the game, it's probably going to be an even split three ways, just so things are better in terms of game balance. So time was running out. Arennicus was getting older. He needed to make some sort of decision, and soon. And then, returning to his palace in the southern town of Lycaron after his latest victorious campaign on the borders, he asked for some time alone in his chamber to nurse a splitting headache. When his guard checked in on him a few hours later, he was lying dead in the pool of blood. Immediately, Lucan convened a gathering of senators in his power base in the north and had himself declared emperor. Okay, so Lucan's going to be leading the northern faction. Garios, campaigning on the Battanian frontier, stood before an assembly of his soldiers who cried out for him to don the purple. I would presume that that means he is going to be leader of like the Western faction, maybe. And Regea emerged from the palace and addressed the throng that had gathered at the reports of the Emperor's death. She raised before them the slain Emperor's robe drenched in his blood. The crowd cried out that she should be Empress, that the Emperor's family must rule from this day on, and that she must take vengeance on his murders. Although who exactly that was at this point was mostly a matter of rumor. Okay, so it sounds like she is going to be the leader of that faction rather than her daughter, and her daughter would presumably be her heir. So kind of a power grab by her, because I don't know of any succession laws that generally support, like when a king dies, his wife becomes ruler. Generally it passes to you know, his son, whether it be the eldest or the youngest or whatever, and then the queen becomes like the queen mother and is more of a regent and advisor than anything else. But there's all sort of succession laws if you're interested in that stuff. Crusader Kings is a great game to play because they have a few of them represented in the game. But again, they don't seem to have any defined successions, so it's just kind of a crapshoot, and that's why they're in this situation. So anyways, let's see. Civil war again loomed, and this time with 3 equally balanced, yeah, exactly what I thought, and determined factions eager to fight. It looked as though it might be more terrible than ever. I'm assuming that she is like the... They have 3 factions, and they're trying to use cardinal directions to define them, and that makes it difficult, because we presumably have a northern one. That's the only one they specified. If the guy Garios here is on the Battanian frontier, he would need to be in the northwest, so I assume like a western third of the faction, and then that leaves either the south or east, which I'm not sure what they've decided to call it, because I've seen several of them referenced, but presumably she would be the leader of the southeastern faction. And then here we get a screenshot of some Calradians living in their Calradian towns. We get to see some of the architecture here, and that arrow looks a bit out of place. I don't know what that's pointing at. Maybe it's a placeholder. But we also get a look at a bit of their clothing as well. So the Empire is the last faction, or rather the last 3 factions to be looked at in our series. It is based on the classical tradition of Greece and Rome and their medieval successor, the Byzantines. There was a lot of change over 2,000 years of history, obviously. Although the Roman Republic became a de facto empire under Augustus, vestigial remnants, like the Senate, persisted to the 1300s. Meanwhile, what started as a bureaucratic state, with prefects and governors appointed for very short terms, evolved into a de facto feudalism by the 11th century, with the Byzantine magnates ruling fiefs and having military obligations like any count or duke in the West. The rules of succession, meanwhile, were never set in stone, which suits our purposes in the game very well. If a player has his or her eye on the purple, there are a lot of different ways of gaining legitimacy. So that's actually really cool. It seems like they're going to put a way in the game for you to kind of maneuver your way to the top of the empire, or at least one of the factions, or maybe your own faction within there, and then win the civil war for yourself and take over. That would be awesome. And that's something I would definitely want to do in a playthrough. The waning years of the Roman Republic, the time of Caesar, Antony, Octavius, Cleopatra, Cato the Younger, and Cicero, have had a huge impact on Western political thinking and are a major inspiration for literature, so we've drawn a few characters from that era. But Byzantine rulers like Justinian and Alexos Komnenos, who brought the empire back from the brink, are equally fascinating personalities, as are the ruling empresses like Zoe and Irene. Okay, so they've obviously taken inspiration from a pretty wide swath of Roman history. They definitely have a little bit of Greek influence in there because, again, they're trying to mirror this faction or these factions after the Byzantines, who had quite a lot of Greek influence themselves, of course being based in the East. So, yeah, it looks like next week they're going to tell us more about the actual representation in game of the Empire. So they're going to talk about troop types and new features to represent the Empire. My biggest concern, and this is something I've addressed in another video, is that at least what we saw initially, the Empire looked to be 3 copy-paste factions, which, if they're trying to have any sort of historical basis, would not be accurate. When the Empire did split, and even before it split, it was very... there was a lot of regional influence, especially on the armies. So it's more obvious when the Empire, split into West and East. But even before that, depending on where a legion was, fighting, the auxiliaries would sort of reflect that area. Not always, of course. You would have auxiliaries attached to legions that would travel all over the place, and so you could see like, Britain cavalry fighting in Spain or something. But for the most part, you did have differences in the Empire, whether it be a single empire or a split empire, depending on where the legion was based out of, and who they were fighting. They, sort of adapted their tactics to fight best in that area. And so my concern was that if they're just going to copy and paste the same troops for 3 different factions, it's not very historically accurate, and it seems a bit boring and lazy. Because then your choices don't really matter as to like which of the 3 factions you side with. Of course, whichever leader you prefer or whichever characters you prefer could have an influence on that choice. But in terms of like the actual faction that you're backing, they're essentially the same faction 3 times, and they just have different lords and leaders. But it's not like my suggestion was to have, like, say, even if most of the troop trees are identical, just having a little bit of specialization in each one, whether it be like 1 or 2 elite units. So maybe having the southern faction have like an elite version of the cataphracts that the other 2 don't have, and then maybe the western one has like elite crossbowmen that the others don't have, or elite heavy infantry, and then the north one can have the opposite or whatever. Just something to sort of differentiate them and have the playstyles be different. Because then, even if you played through one faction and brought them to prominence over the other 2, if there was some differences in them, then you would have the option. I mean, you would have it anyways, but you wouldn't really necessarily want to. There would be more, what's the word? There'd be more reason for you to maybe want to go back and try it as the other 2. Whereas if they're all identical except for the lords, then it just, all it really affects is which direction you're conquering in. Are you conquering east? Are you conquering north? Are you conquering south? So I guess we'll find out next week, but I do hope that they're going to differentiate them a little bit more than just who's leading them and who's backing them. Because I think that could make for some really interesting gameplay. And again, give you a reason to maybe go back in a different playthrough and try a different third of the Empire. So anyways, we'll leave it here. This is already a little bit longer than I was intending, but, whatever. So thank you guys so much for watching. I had a great time talking about Bannerlord and the Empire with you, and I look forward to seeing you guys back here next week for a little bit more on the Empire. So I'll see you then.